announce this series talk, one of our friends wanted to know how we could take 5 evenings to it, when really there seemed to be so little to talk about. Actually, there's more than meets the eye. And to make much of it intelligible and factual, we have to make enough digressions into related fields to need some time for clarification. So in proper spirit we start this evening with a digression, but it is relevant to the subject. 2 theories have long existed as to how the cultural life of mankind spread throughout the world. The first of these theories assumes that the plateau of mankind rises collectively over a long period of time, that there is a universal evolution pressure that moves behind all peoples, pressing them forward, and that this motion has as its exceptions only a few groups of minor importance that in one way or another have been left behind or have been unable, through decadence or through the inferiority of bloodstream, to maintain the general pace. This would mean, at least theoretically, that throughout the world the mere fact that a nation or race comes into existence implies that were it solitary and alone, without contact with any other group, it would slowly evolve its own culture and would finally level off with the common culture of the world. There are many strong advocates of this idea, and it has quite an attractive appeal. We like to think of it also with individuals, that the person is moved by forces which, regardless of what he does, will ultimately bring him into the level of his kind, so that by the mere circumstance of birth he is destined for a noble place among his contemporary cultures. The second theory or attitude is that culture actually moves from centers, and that these centers form what has been called a symphonic cultural theme, that people after people, race after race, will be touched by a certain common motion contributed from centers of culture or from neighboring peoples, or by the rise of a particular group whose achievements will be spread over an area. Therefore, what we call the rise of peoples is actually the result of their coming into contact with other peoples, coming into contact particularly with cultures superior to their own. Now, we know this presents a basic problem, and if we wish to hypothetically assume that the first man had to grow that way, we would be having trouble locating the superior culture to which he is indebted. Thus we have a situation which has to be thought through rather carefully. We cannot, however, at any point in our study take the time to advance the general study of primogeniture. We cannot know who came first or who had the preceding ability. Our primary concern now is to determine a theory, or to make it as reasonable and practical as we can. If, therefore, we wish to assume that all peoples have a common impetus behind them, and left to their own devices and isolated in a jungle or in a swamp or on an island, will still develop parallel attainments with other peoples, then we may assume that the Chinese enriched their culture without any reference to outside powers, and if there are certain similarities between the arts and cultures of China and those of Egypt, these similarities are accidental. They are simply the result of individuals working out problems, and because of reasoning powers which they possess, arriving at similar or even identical conclusions. Against this theory, however, is something else which we cannot completely disregard, namely that various areas of the earth's surface have certainly produced widely different cultures. There is not merely one story behind the growth of human life. There are several basic stories, and these stories do not fit into this idea that all persons or all groups must inevitably arrive at the same conclusions. Rather, we know that we can divide the progress of mankind into streams or rivers, of which there become several prominent streams. These streams may mingle, but their identities are never lost. And at some remote time in the future, these individual streams can separate again and continue on their own ways without being completely absorbed into any other cultural motion. This leaves us with certain problems which can be approached in one way or another. A French writer, in a work called The Migration of Symbols, attempted to show, as Wilson did with his swastika migrations, that certain symbols moving about the earth, traveling very slowly but inevitably from culture to culture, become, so to say, the footprints of borrowings. That the motions of these basic symbols can be used to prove how ideas are transferred from one group to another. The swastika migration is an excellent example of that. This very primitive glyph appears upon the most primitive and crude stone carvings. As a pictoglyphic representation, it is to be found on the rocks and cliffs of our own southwest. This same emblem appears among the Nordic peoples of Scandinavia, Finland, and those areas. It is strong in India and in China, and it is to be found wherever cultural groups seemingly have some contact with each other. The passing of this swastika symbol is certainly widely noted. Pottery designs are another stream, which, including such devices as the swastika, certain primitive bird symbols, animal symbols, geometric forms and structures, seem to travel according to distinct routes through the mysteries of the ancient world. Another interesting migratory symbol is the bow and arrow, a primitive instrument of both defense and offensive warfare. And do not think for a moment that when we say bow and arrow that we are exhausting the theme. Even this simple device is susceptible of numerous types, kinds, and forms which are highly individualistic and which can also be traced. Now we know, for example, that we can trace the migration of the bow and arrow down from the Bering Straits along our own western seaboard. In fact, we can trace it practically throughout the United States. But for some unknown reason, when we come to the borders of Mexico, we lose it. Why did this bow and arrow not proceed down through the peninsula of Yucatan? We do not know. These people do not seem to have originally possessed this instrument, although later, of course, they became aware of its use. Their primitive instrument was the atlatl, the throwing stick. And this was their ancient and traditional weapon. Thus, this migration of the bow and arrow does not completely cover all areas any more than the swastika does, or the monolithic construction of ancient times, or certain types of drawings, carvings, and pottery, ornamentation, beadwork. the scarification of the skin, the development of various totems, taboos, and things of this nature. These all can be traced, and from their elaborate tracings, we are inclined to support the belief that these things did migrate, that there is a strong case for the belief that culture was contagious, that it passed from one people to another. We have already pointed out that nearly all ancient nations trace their origins to preceding nations, or to messengers, or to teachers, messiahs, and godlings, who brought to them a higher degree of culture than they, as primitive peoples, possessed. Thus, most nations do not claim to have originated their arts and sciences, but to have received them, either from the gods or from some other preceding cultural group. This leads us then gradually into the theme which we wish to emphasize tonight. For we are seeking further evidence of the Atlantic migrations, the Atlantic philosophy, and the Atlantic symbolism. And we want to start with a consideration of certain areas covered a number of years ago by the African explorer, anthropologist, and ethnologist, Leo Frobenius. Frobenius did a tremendous work in quietly meditating upon the origin of African culture. He realized that he was in the presence of a very ancient people. He realized also, as historians have since noted, that he was privileged to know only the remnants of this people. That wherever you turn in Africa, you are in the presence of traditions, of legends, of fables and myths, of allegories and doctrines, and also of the most strange, bizarre, and extravagant symbols. And Frobenius came to the conclusion that there were two distinct African cultures. One of these cultures was apparently indigenous. It originated somewhere within the boundaries of the African area. The other culture was not actually indigenous, although it had been resident there for a very long time. He strengthens his position by showing that there are at least two basic concepts of life held in Africa, that these concepts of life are essentially irreconcilable, and that also these concepts represent distinctly different levels of social origin. One concept is considerably more exalted than the other. One concept indicates a greater experience background than the other. One, the more primitive, would be likely in the area. It would be consistent with the gradual emergence of a very primitive human type, a type gradually struggling its way through thousands of years to final adjustment with its environment. The other type shows a completely different background. One of the points that Frobenius makes is that the indigenous type is dominated and permeated with a strange, subtle humility. It is the humility of the child, the humility of the primitive, of that which is growing up in a world of wonder. And these simpler peoples have never come into conflict with their environment. They grow up truly, as he calls them, children of nature. They accept everything without doubt, with infinite patience, and if necessary, with mortal suffering. These people do not seem to have any grandeur in them. They do not seem to require it. They are certainly God's meat, and they have their own ways and their own happiness. They are not a miserable people, but they are a people of childlike disposition. Like small children, they can be difficult. Like small children, they can be headstrong. But underneath it all, there is very little innate sophistication. The other group, which seemingly comes from a totally different cultural level, is penetrated and permeated throughout its structure with a strange hauteur, with a mysterious grandeur, with a sense of descent from great and noble forebears. This second group, therefore, is composed essentially of the proud, those who raise their heads high, those to whom simple ways are not enough, those in whose social and political structure there are evidences of complexes of greatness, whose social code is involved and complicated and bound with numerous obligations, whose religion is deep and ancient and demands a great deal of self-discipline and self-control. These strange peoples are not simply children of nature. They have already reached that cultural platform in which they seek to dominate nature, that they seek to be strong and to use nature. They have already come to that time in which they will not accept inevitables, but will struggle against them to the death. These people have always had a proud heritage, and among them also there has been an astonishing maturity of arts and considerable basic growth in sciences. These peoples have much more cleverness, much more astuteness than those other tribes which seem to belong to a simpler stock. Most of all, perhaps, these proud ones, these ancient ones, like the brave, heroic, gigantic Ashantis, have this background of nobility. They dream back to kings and emperors and great empires. They look back upon a time in which they had vast temporal powers that have slipped away. And they believe and remember how their civilization was created by 16 gods who, descending from the skies, established these people as chosen, set apart and dedicated for a strange and wonderful destiny. Thus these strong, mysterious peoples feel themselves to be moved by a destiny, to have a purpose or a reason. Ambition has been born in them. Pride has grown in them. And we no longer have these simple, primitive peoples. This does not mean that the proud ones live visibly in great splendor. They do not. But comparatively, they live in a different way. Theirs is not the simple jungle village. Theirs is the town with broad avenues and streets, with palaces for their chiefs and rulers, with temples for their gods, with the actual architectural foundation of a mature community. These people believed in broad thoroughfares, in clean towns and villages, and they lived together on a level of considerable cultural refinement. They held obligations with sacredness. They kept their word. They punished their criminals. They rewarded the good. They sought the advice of the old and the wise. And these peoples applauded wisdom, regarded it as important, and held high offices open to the learned, whereas among the more primitive people, leadership was mostly in the hands of the physically strong. So these other groups had reached the point where they appreciated strength of mind above strength of body. And they did not really feel that they had grown up out of the jungle. They felt that they had been exiled into the jungle from a better state, from some ancient background that was real and deep and valuable. As might also be expected, these people were more belligerent, more aggressive, more likely to defend their domains. And when European nations came into contact with them, they found them much more difficult to colonize or to control or to subjugate. because among these natives there was this sense of great dignity, and they refused to regard themselves merely as waifs in the African hinterland. They held themselves to be equal to any person who could come to them, and they wished to be treated as equals by the greatest, the bravest, and the strongest. Frobenius makes quite a careful study of these two types as telling something that is worth thinking about and remembering. Now, in the area which we call today Nigeria, which is divided into two general areas also, northern and southern Nigeria, we have the center of this particular aggressive, positive culture. Nigeria is on the west coast of Africa, above the center, and overshadowed by the great northern area of the African continent. It is somewhat east of Liberia, and is not very far from the British colony of Lagos. This Nigerian area has always been distinguished for a very progressive and intelligent people, capable of accepting learning perhaps more rapidly than most of the other African areas. Now, in this particular group, in this situation or contiguous to it, we have a number of cultures arising which are important. One was the culture of Benin. Benin was first open to the Western modern European, who contacted this African tribal unit with astonishment. Great Benin was a city ruled over by an ancient aristocracy. It was ruled over by a proud and splendid ruler. And this city was rich with treasure and achievement. It had magnificent arts and crafts. It had a dignity, a sedateness, a maturity, an absolute atmosphere of a metropolitan existence, long before it had been contacted by European traders or missionaries. Another area in the same general group is Ife. And the Ife people are noted for their bronze casting. Most of the ancient casting in bronze in Africa is done in this general region, involving Yoruba, Benin, and Ife. In these groups, the art of using bronze was brought to a very high degree of skill, and the Ife masks and carvings and the great Benin heads, amulets, and even chain armor, their helmets and their crowns, their swords and their ceremonial instruments, are of a very superior degree of workmanship. Their ancient legends tell us that this ability to work bronze was given to them by very ancient leaders who came from a distant place. In any event, this work in bronze has intrigued archaeologists ever since it has first been noted. Unfortunately, as the result of an accident, but involving an expedition against Benin because of its attack upon colonial civilians, in the course of trying to destroy some of the political aggression of this tribe, their city accidentally was burned. No one intended to burn it, but it was one of those unfortunate incidents which often accompany war. And in the destruction of their city, the heat destroyed most of their bronze artifacts, so that good examples of this type of work are comparatively rare and fetch a very high price in the market. But they are, without doubt, one of the strongest, most important forms of primitive art. They are perhaps among the greatest of folk art, so great that today the most sophisticated European and American collector congratulates himself if he can possess a genuine example of this work. It is a very high degree of craftsmanship. Now, these people are surrounded by other groups who have no such knowledge, have never practiced such arts, and are considerably less advanced in most of their social organizations. Frobenius, considering this carefully, would like to think that two cultures exist, therefore, in this African area. And while he does not actually say so, he is inclined to believe that the so-called primitive culture is much older than this sophisticated culture. That the primitive culture represents an almost unchanging primordial state down through the ages, a culture which will respond to civilizing influences much more slowly than that in these important but limited areas. He considers the second group to be more recent, yet of course ancient, but having achieved a great deal more of pressureful progress due to incentive and drive within the people itself, that they therefore represent two kinds of stock. And Frobenius definitely states in his book that he believes that the Ife people and the Yorubi and the Benin people are actually Atlanteans. He has studied the Atlantic theory very carefully, and he bases his contention upon a series of important factors. First, he has analyzed not only the cults, the crafts and arts of these people, but their religious cults. He observes in the religion of this area the tremendous veneration for the sea god. These people claimed or believed that they descended from a god of the oceans. This sea god corresponds very closely with the Poseidon of the Greek legends. These people also had deep and distant memory of great cities, and most of all of an archetypal concept of the palace and the temple. Most of your African people have no such archetypal concept, but these groups recognize what Frobenius calls the archetypal templum, the idea of the great and glorious sanctuary in the center of the life of the people. These people also differ from other African tribes in their attitude toward the gods and the deities. To them, these deities are not ghosts, and therefore they cannot be regarded as simple animists, as some would like to believe. Frobenius discovered sufficient information to convince him that the hierarchy concept, the divine development of peoples from a God origin, was known to these groups and was part of their mystery ritual. Also, the Yorubis and others were perfectly aware of the existence of one supreme deity. They were not subject merely to nature worship. They did not simply offer various sacrifices to animate or inanimate objects, or devote themselves completely to the fetishes and talisman and jujus of African tribes. They had a strong central theological concept, a concept in which all men and mortals descended from divine parentage, that the gods came first. And in their effort to describe and to symbolize these gods, they reached into the subconscious of their own collective memory and brought forth noble and glorious convictions about these deities. Your truly primitive person does not do this. He grows up into his religion. But these people, such as the Ife, had the realization of a tremendously brilliant, glorious, divine world, a world of heroes, a world of persons possessing unusual talents, so that their gods were almost the equal, if not the equal, of the gods of the Latins and the Greeks. Heroic beings, possessing not only the strength of body and of mind, but graces and qualities. For among these people the gods of mercy were not unknown. The gods who should be thanked for the goodness of living were not unknown. Frobenius, therefore, comes very strongly to the belief that these peoples did have a strong background contact with a more sophisticated and unfolding culture platform or culture concept. Now, another group of archaeologists and students moving in on this subject and remembering, as several of them did, the possibility of the Egyptian being a remnant of the Atlantean Empire, the Atlanteans who could not go home after the Athenian campaign because of the destruction of their continent, that the Egyptian might hold the clue to the mystery of Atlantis in Africa. The Egyptian does hold certain clue, there is no question about it. Budge, in his study of Osiris and the Egyptian resurrection, shows the motion southward from Egypt of the cultural stream of the Egyptians. He reminds us that for a long time the Egyptian empire was under the dynastic rulership of Ethiopian kings. And Budge is also quite certain that down in Central Africa, particularly in the area of the Ashanti, there is great evidence that these people migrated from Egypt, moving southward at a remote period and gradually falling away from the high level of culture to a comparatively lower level, that they were isolated from contact with the greater things that had moved them and dominated them, so that they finally relapsed into a more or less primitive state. As a proof of this particular point, Budge and several others have shown the resemblances between the ornamentations, the artifacts, the jewelry, adornment, rituals, and so forth of the present Ashanti and the ancient pieces excavated in the classical Egyptian area. There is much, therefore, to show that a comparatively high culture moved downward from North Africa into the central parts of the great African continent. Frobenius and many others have long felt that the legends and myths centering around the more inaccessible parts of the African continent should still be given a great deal of consideration. They believe that we may discover on that continent in time evidences of a very ancient and very high civilization. That we may sometime come upon ancient cities that will be as glorious as Corinth or Ephesus. That we may find ruins of magnificent palaces and temples belonging to a culture that has completely vanished from memory. When we say from memory, we mean from all memory except that of these primitive tribes which have retained a half memory, a memory which is reserved mostly and revealed through their arts, through their instinctive reactions to things, and through the strange lordliness of their manners and of their broad attitudes toward life. So let us assume for a moment the possibility that Frobenius and these others are telling us that in Africa we have two levels of culture, one Lemurian and the other Atlantean. That these patient, mysterious, silent, humble ones belong to the old Lemurian order, and that what we call today the proud African, the Ashanti warrior who may stand over 7 feet tall, the Ife who has never for one moment acknowledged actual domination by anyone. The wonderful artisans who created the bronze and the ivory work which has distinguished Benin. These belong to the Atlantean level. Now, in passing, there is a point that is rather interesting. In the 2nd and 3rd century of the Christian era, there arose in North Africa a group called the Gnosis. The Gnostics had a symbol, a very interesting and remarkable symbol. This symbol was a human body, usually with the head of a rooster, sometimes, however, with the head of a man. The arms and shoulders quite clearly defined, one hand holding a whip and the other a shield. The lower part of the body, below the waist of this figure, slowly turned into serpents, so that the legs were composed of two curved serpents. And these serpents formed a strange type of design. The legs descended and then turned outward and up again as the shape of the serpent and ended in the serpent's heads. It was quite a strange thing, resembling a little bit the inverted form of the hook that was used with a hook and eye in old fastenings before we had zippers. This hook and eye consisted of two loops by which the hook could be sewn onto the garment, and this form was very much that particular shape. I don't like to just draw it in the air for you. It might seem strange, but the symbol you will find in our large book, and we have other books in the library which we can show you. But the Gnostic deity Abraxas was represented in this way. We have no record of the use of the Abraxas form for centuries until it was revived at a very much later date in Italy and France during the restoration of the copying of classical gems and of ancient artifacts, in which during the period of Louis XIV we have the arriving of these wonderful crafts which were restored from ancient crafts. But a traveler reaching Great Benin before its destruction was permitted to see some of the ancient bronze work representing the ruler. In harmony with other peculiarities of this rite, the ruler of Benin was always represented as standing with his hands in this position and an assistant holding under each elbow. In other words, a servant, or perhaps a counselor, or perhaps a prince of the house, had the honor or dignity of standing one on each side and holding up the hands and arms of the ruler. The ruler perhaps had this requirement because he carried very heavy bronze ceremonial objects, which perhaps were so heavy that it was necessary for someone to help him maintain them at this outstretched position. But anyway, a figure stood on each side holding up the arms of the obi, or the king, or the prince, so represented. The interesting thing is that the lower part of the body of the ruler ended with these serpent legs turned up and out again, exactly like the figures of the Gnosis in the 2nd and 3rd century of Egypt. No other place on earth does the Gnostic symbol appear except in the area around the Ife culture. This has caused several persons to question whether at some time there was not a strong cultural tradition moving southward out of Egypt and going further and further into the mysterious hinterland. Now in this also we have legends, as Budge and Breasted have both pointed out. And these legends would seem to indicate that the Ashantis and other peoples in the Central African area, who had apparently migrated southward from Egypt, did so to escape the persecutions that resulted in the destruction of their religions, and that these people represented a kind of high priesthood that moved south very much in the same way as the legends tell us another form of the Egyptian religious body moved into Europe to become the gypsies after the collapse of the classical civilization in the delta of the Nile region. In any event, these peoples of Central Africa claim to possess certain secrets, certain knowledge, certain sacred arts and sciences, and also that they have never lost their knowledge of the mystical arts and the magical practices of the ancient Egyptians. Here then comes another one of these migration factors. Your migration of magic is one of the most fascinating and extraordinary of all these themes. Magic moved upon a level. It traveled into distant places, always associated with certain rites and ceremonies. And these rites and ceremonies assume the possession of certain knowledge. And this knowledge was apparently diffused among all the peoples that we now assume or suspect to have been Atlantean. For this reason we may say that the magic of Ife and Yoruba is an entirely different magic from that of the witch doctors of the general African area. This magic of these superior tribes is based upon a kind of internal knowledge, a knowledge of things remembered, a knowledge secretly passed on. And because magic is always the basis of the secret society in African life, we are not surprised to find that among these people the secret society is an extremely strong structure, just as it was with the American Indian, just as we find in the Mede rituals and rites, and also in the Pueblo rites of the Southwest. These rituals have to do with the reception of the child or the young person into the religion of his tribe. And this religion includes the conferring of certain magical power. The power to achieve certain things through prayer, through meditation, through the cultivation of breath, through the preparation of magical symbols and designs like the Navajo sand paintings. There was always the magic ritual. Dr. Churchward, not the Moo man, but his brother, who was a well-known archaeologist, Dr. Albert Churchward points out that in the African religious rituals we have, like in the case of the Han Society in China, a drawing upon old religious beliefs, old legends, and old lore, anciently known but then apparently forgotten. In the performance of their rites, nearly all primitive peoples do one of two things. They either make use of a highly involved structure which stands for the purpose as a permanent part of the furniture of their community, or else they build a particular and special structure according to ancient and traditional lines. And here we can step across into the Polynesian area and into the Pacific region and find certain definite parallels. Even in an area as near to us as the Hawaiian Islands, the religious initiation rites anciently included the construction of a kind of building practically identical with the Jewish tabernacle. It was divided into a larger and a smaller room and surrounded by an enclosed courtyard. An initiation consisted of advancing from the west to the east through the outer courtyard into the larger inner room and finally into the sanctum sanctorum, where stood or reposed the emblem or symbol of the divine power. The initiation included circumambulation, or the traveling about these rooms. the meeting of certain dangers and obstacles, and finally, in the final degree of the ritual, the communication of the essential mystery or secret of life. We find this also throughout the Polynesian area and down into the Dutch East Indies, into many regions where as yet we have made but slight effort to revive our knowledge of these cultures. Frobenius tells us something else that is of importance. He points out the peculiar effect of foreign religious imposition on the lives of these people. He points out that at various times these African natives have been converted to other faiths. They were, some of them, converted by Muslims. They have also been converted by Christian missionaries and peoples of that nature. And in many instances, these conversions have led to a considerable improvement in the social life of the primitive tribes. But wherever these conversions touched these high people, these strong people, something else happened. These people absorbed the new ideas, but were not converted. They fitted them into a pattern older than that which the missionary brought them. They accepted certain good things. They became aware, but they found a place for the new beliefs within the structure of their own, rather than being moved from their own into a new belief. He therefore comes to the conclusion that there has to have been, and still remain, a very great vitality in the convictions of these people, who were able to rationally adapt a new faith to their own, coming out with something that was better, but still their own. A condition which we do not generally observe, where these missionaries impact upon a truly primitive group. So we have these possibilities to think about. Now let us consider for a moment, both in the Polynesians and in the African area, something about this mysterious ceremonial of initiation, which may and often does include the construction of a temporary symbolic structure to represent a universal mystery. We would assume that the preparation of this structure would call upon their most ancient beliefs and ideas, and this is essentially true. So we find, in working into the secret societies of Africa, we find, for instance, that they made mounds and arranged rocks and prepared certain designs, much as our own Plains Indians did, always also creating labyrinths or mazes around and through which the candidates had to walk to symbolize, like the labyrinth of Crete, the mysterious and mortal involvement through which man passes. Discussing some of these points relating to the African thought, we can gain some interesting point. Their study of the heaven world, the universe from which this universe came, the orientation of our world in a space greater than this world, was known to the Yorubis and many of the other people. It was known to the people of Ife and also to the Ashanti. So what did they do? They symbolized the primitive world, the divine world, the home of the gods, by a mountain. They placed this in the form of a mound in the central or most sacred part of their ceremonial structure. It was from this mountain that life came. It descended down the mountain. It spread from this mountain all over the world. This mountain of the gods, or the heaven mountain, on the summit of which, in the sky, is the abode of the immortals, is certainly your Asgard, your Olympus, and your Meru. These people had some basic association with these older beliefs. From this mountain also there descended the will of the gods, the messengers, and the ancient ones. For the world was first populated by gods who descended from the mountain. In the ancient Indic culture, this mountain would have been the Meru, and the descent would have been upon the polar cap from which the great progressive development of continents was believed to have taken place. This Meru or Sumuru, this Mount Kailasa of modern India, represents without question to these people some part of the map of their homeland. The ancient symbolic representations of Atlantis indicate that the city of the Golden Gate was upon the side of a mountain, and that the entire Atlantic area was surmounted by a peak, which was the abode of the gods. This seemingly was the place of the sacred city, and the people of Africa also regarded their origin as from a divine world where there stood a sacred city, and that this sacred city was the abode of their most remote progenitors. It was a beautiful, glorious, golden, glowing city. It was far above anything belonging to this world. Therefore it had to be divine. But it could well have been this same mysterious city of Atlantis, with its walls of orichalcum, as described by Plato. From this mysterious land came the memory of great things, and the knowledge of arts and crafts, which were slowly perpetuated. This knowledge continued. But it was inevitable that the perpetuation of this knowledge should bring into manifestation the mystery system, the ritual. For in this ritual we have the communication to the young man of the wisdom of his tribe, or the knowledge of his elders. And the mysteries were set aside to keep knowledge alive. This mystery system exists everywhere where there is a suspicion that the Atlantic culture touched. This mystery system was also associated with the university system, with schooling. And many of the old temples were also observatories, laboratories, places like clinics where the sick came to be healed. These old buildings, patterned apparently from a basic archetype, represented structures of universal learning, existing originally in a remote world, a distant place. And as time went on and these peoples wandered from this land, they could no longer build such temples, they could no longer leave such monuments, but they left in the place of them symbolic ritualistic structures, each one of which was in memory of the great building. Higgins, in his Masonic researches, points out that scattered about the world are a series of magnificent and ancient ruins. Each one of these ruins is in a way equally mysterious. We have very little satisfactory account of their building, or even of the time in which they were built. Many of them stand now deserted in jungles. What happened to their peoples we do not know. Two good examples of these deserted areas, deserted even after the rise of European culture, would be Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the great center of the Khmer culture, and the peninsula of Yucatan, the great center of the later Maya culture in the Western Hemisphere. Both of these areas were deserted within the last 1,000 years. No one knows why. No one knows what happened to the people. And there is really no knowledge as to the basic design, purpose, or pattern beneath these great remains. We study them, however, and we come immediately to one realization. All these monuments are built upon one grand theme. In every case, they represent a complex of structures surrounding a central mountain, a great raised place in the middle. This raised place is usually surrounded by a square, and down the faces of the square descend the great staircases which lead to the four directions of the world. This is the motive in the central building of Angkor Wat, and it is the same motive exactly that we find in the temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza in Yucatan. Also, in Angkor there is a great balustrade of serpents, and at Angkor there is the same development of the great sea serpent theme. This comes back to us at Chichen Itza, for the balustrades of the Great Pyramid are conventionalized serpents, and at the foot of each of the great staircases is the head of the serpent. Thus, the combination of the pyramid and the serpent occurs in many areas, and wherever the pyramid arises in mythology and legendary, it is universally assumed that it represents a great mountain. It is a symbol of the world mountain, the mother mountain, the great mountain of the Jains in India, which is the axis mountain of the earth. Also, this mountain is always the abode of the gods, and always in the uppermost and highest part of this mountain will be the sanctuary of the deity. At Jakarta in Java, we have also the great Buddhist monument, the Borobudur. Here we have likewise the basic square structure surmounted by circular terraces, climaxed or crested with a dagoba or tower, which originally contained a relic of Buddha. Up each of the faces ascend the staircases, and the ornamentations include serpents and dragons. All these buildings, therefore, have something to do with the book of Revelation, where there is a reference to the city foursquare with its gates, and in the midst of which is the glory of the Lamb. In Africa, in Polynesia, in China, in India, in ancient Greece, North America, South America, Central America, this theme is infinitely repeated, and it is the opinion of a great many scholars that there is only one reasonable solution to this, namely that we are in the presence of the dominant culture theme of the Atlantean era or epoch, namely that the great symbol of the Atlantic world was their own glorious city, the city from which all of their culture came, their university temple city, and that all these mountains represent the great temple of Poseidon, ruler over Posidonis, this wonderful temple on the top of a peak, or at least well onto the side of a mountain, and remembered as a kind of center where learning, wisdom, and the divine laws were kept. For it was in the temple of this god of the sea that the ancient tablets were preserved, giving the will of the gods for mankind. If people migrating in various directions and at various times had traveled in different directions from their motherland and had sought finally to establish their cultures again, they would not have the fantastic wealth or the tremendous number of skilled laborers or probably the wonderful basic materials with which to work. Remember, these people were scattered by a great catastrophe. Most of them escaped only with their lives. They found themselves in primitive worlds. They found themselves far from the familiar and the known. But at the same time, they found themselves likewise with a great gratitude in their hearts, regardless of the tragedy and horror that had come, the great darkness that had swallowed up their city with fire and water. They had been spared, and it became essential for them to restore their religion, to reestablish their faith wherever they were. Even as the children of Israel, moving in the wilderness for 40 years, found it necessary to the preservation of their faith that they create a tabernacle which was portable, which could be disassembled and reassembled as need arose. So these other people wandering about undoubtedly created various types of structures. They created according to the available materials. Where they remained long and established powerful centers, they built much more massively and much more permanently. And where their sojourn was brief, they naturally left less permanent and less solid remains. But around the world and in the passing of time in their strange wanderings, these people left culture after culture behind them. We do not know why. Perhaps they were driven out by the rise of other peoples around them, or as some have suspected, they perished or were forced to leave because of the impoverishment of soil and some basic lack of knowledge of hygiene or sanitation. Perhaps they were unable to survive in climates and conditions distant from their own. Perhaps they destroyed their food supplies and were unable to replenish them. For in Central America, certainly, one of the great themes in the whole area was the impoverishment of soil and the necessity for the annual burning of the land in order to provide food. Perhaps some of these structures also were placed in inhospitable climates where it was not possible for the people to live and remain healthy, as in the morasses of Palenque in the Mexican area. In any event, these buildings were progressively left. Perhaps in some cases these people were overrun by other tribes who led them into captivity. And again, it is possible that race suicide destroyed some of them. But all around are the bones of these ancient structures. Another group of thinkers have come to a somewhat different conclusion, namely that even perhaps before the destruction of Atlantis, during its great period of colonization, temples and centers could have been established in comparatively distant areas. For instance, we observe the spread of religion in our world as it is today. We note the wonderful buildings in France and in Germany and in Italy. We observe also that fine religious structures have sprung up on our hemisphere. And the cathedrals of Europe are not to be regarded as so much better than the great cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, which is being built on precisely the same principles, with a tremendous time-labor equivalence of those of the cathedrals of the ancient world. It's quite possible that these buildings existed before the destruction of Atlantis, at least some of them, where the more highly advanced colonization developments had brought perhaps Atlantean families and communities into permanent residence in distant places. So that the Atlanteans had their colonies, as we have, and that their own people were served by priesthoods and temples created for the purpose, and also for the worship of converted natives of the same general regions. If this great colonizing plan collapsed due to the destruction of its central island, then it is quite possible that the peoples gradually drifted away from the knowledge of the arts and sciences which were originally taught. Budge brings up the Osiris legend in Egypt of the destruction of the good god by Typhon, who is the symbol of storms and violence, and considers the possibility of an Osirian era, an era of wisdom and light, destroyed by flames, fire, war, pestilence, and death. The same thought occurs in Central America, where the god Quetzalcoatl is finally destroyed by a fire spirit, who corresponds very closely to the Typhon or Set monster of the Egyptians. If then it is conceivable that the Atlantic culture represented the establishment of powerful institutions, it is also quite understandable why the legends continue to remain, that at one time man possessed divine knowledge, that he possessed the secret of all things, that he possessed the word of power. In Egypt, he possessed the mysterious power represented by the unsated cross, or the Crux ansata, the key to the mystery of eternal life, the key to the true meaning of God and to the sacred name. Symbolism which we find in Egypt, where the goddess Isis throws Re, the sun god, under a spell and finally forces him to reveal his true name, which is the word of power. In the Egyptian legend, the death of Osiris resulted in the loss of the word of life. The death of Osiris could be very symbolical. It could represent, for one thing, the loss of the descent of the great hierarchical priestly orders. With the destruction of Atlantis, it was no longer possible for disciples and students to reach this great center of learning and be duly invested with the secrets of divine magic. Therefore, by degrees, these temples scattered about the world, for loss of the great central spiritual authority, fell into decline and to decay. They were served for a time by priests who used substitute rituals, who found various ways to perpetuate as best they could the old rites, but with no longer the civilizing influences, no longer contact, with great problems arising and the decadence of their own local groups, these buildings fell into decline and were gradually forgotten. There is also, of course, the very definite possibility that these great temples, variously located, were never actually cities, that they were universities or schools, like the great Nalanda in India, and that there were no communities around them, and that they were always in the midst of jungles, as in the rites of Xibalba among the Quiches of Central America, and that pilgrims and truth seekers journeyed into these inaccessible areas to receive instructions from venerable orders of priests who never mingled with mankind. If these venerable orders gradually died out, the buildings remained in the jungle, which gradually also encroached upon them until they disappeared from the sight of medieval or even ancient men. All of this complex of buildings, variously but magnificently located in the most important culture zones of the earth, apparently designed with the skill of advanced geometry and with a wonderful knowledge of building materials. Buildings in which great structures were held together solely by the lacing of their own carvings, or as in the case of the Great Pyramid, where the stones were fitted together with cement no thicker than writing paper. And this cement so strong that it is easier to break a stone than it is to divide it from another. We do not know all of the answers, but we begin to suspect that there are answers that are different from what we have believed. We know that the builders of these monuments were great experts in architecture and art, in mathematics and in astronomy. We know that they worshipped astronomical symbols, and that among their buildings many were actually dedicated as observatories. We know that these people are not the ones whom we find scattered in little thatched villages around these monuments. The modern peoples claim descent from these older ones, but they claim a descent of gradual forgetfulness. They do not remember their forebears. Many of them do not even speak the ancient languages of their gods. They are now merely remnants, looking as astonished as the average tourist upon the shrines and temples of the past. While I was at Uxmal in Yucatan, one day a whole group of Mayas, we call them 100% Mayas, they really were, came in a kind of a bus from one of the neighboring towns. They were tourists visiting their own ruins. None of them had ever seen them before. And they were as amazed and dumbfounded as any absolute stranger. They did not have a memory of who built these structures. But among the old men, among the ancient ones, there were legends. Always there are legends. And these legends had to do with times long gone by when a race of gods walked the earth. Same legends in Africa. Same legends among the heroic peoples of the Polynesian islands. Here in Samoa, in the Hebrides, and in all through this area, children initiated into the rituals of their tribes watch the building of the sacred mountain and learn again that it is from this ancient mountain that the laws of their people once came, as these laws thundered from the crest of the blazing volcanic peak of Sinai. All these legends. And there seems to be some meaning for them that they should be so universally distributed. Now, it is interesting also to trace what you might call this distribution story in areas very far removed from the Atlantic Ocean. We could imagine that any group of people inhabiting the Atlantic shore, either on the eastern or western side, would be somewhat acquainted with these stories, especially if they related back to the old legends of their people. But why should the people of Tahiti or one of these islands in the extreme opposite side of the world, natives of Madagascar, or why should the primitive peoples of the Philippine Islands have similar stories? Yet it is true that the primitive records of the natives, the old, forgotten natives, like the Batus of Sumatra, the very old ones, the Bushmen of Australia, these people all record that long ago, once upon a time, there was a great deluge, and this deluge destroyed the great lands and changed continents into oceans. And at that time, great cultures, great races of giants, races of heroic beings, even the gods and demigods themselves, vanished away in a Ragnarok of fire and destruction. How did these people find out about it? What is the reason for their memory? Why is the story of the deluge still carefully traced upon the totem poles of our Alaskan and Canadian Indians? Yet they have their deluge myth just as surely as did the people of Mesopotamia. There has to be another and a little more light cast upon this situation. Assuming for a moment now what we must assume from actual available record, there should have been and well was a long continental shelf extending out from India and involving part of Australia, a tremendous area, on which most of what we call the Polynesian and Malaysian islands, or Melanesian islands, are a part. that just as surely as we had a continental shelf in the Atlantic, we had a vast shelf in the Indian Ocean, a shelf of land area perhaps as large as that we associate with Atlantis. It is difficult to imagine what may have happened. It is possible that at a very remote time, the sinking of this Lemurian shelf in the Asiatic side, the Gondwana land of ancient legend and lore, resulted in the emergence of Atlantis. Or it is possible that the great cataclysm which destroyed Atlantis also shook down this Pacific shelf, causing in that way what might well have passed to be something more important than we think of in connection with Atlantis. If the Atlantic catastrophe was not merely located in the Atlantic basin, but represented some tremendous cataclysm that involved both the eastern and western hemispheres, and the possibility that these disorders and these changes affected tides and water distributions, causing perhaps the entire Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Ocean group to be agitated and disturbed, then perhaps we could understand why the peoples of the eastern hemisphere could have and would have a similar story. Something of this kind had to have happened to explain the Chinese knowledge and the belief, of course, that they had that vast areas like the Gobi Desert or the great Shamo sand ocean was, of course, at one time underwater. All of this points out not simply a local catastrophe, but perhaps a much larger one, one of greater magnitude, greater significance, in which two or more poles of a great disaster struck nearly at the same time, or close enough for their historical backgrounds to be interwoven. It seems, therefore, reasonably certain that the African continent that we know today was, particularly East Africa, toward the Asiatic side, perhaps originally connected with the Lemurian or Gondwana land distribution, whereas West Africa, as we know it today, might well have been contiguous to and highly influenced by the Atlantean culture and its disaster. This would support the belief of Frobenius that two distinct cultures, one much older than the other, flourished together on this continent. We have no evidence at this time as to the cultural level of the ancient Lemurian group. What we seemingly find is that they did not attain to any pronounced skill or ability in the preparation or preservation of records. They did not appear to have built extensively or to have created any monumental palaces or temples or to have highly perfected any permanent art. This would correspond to their psychology today, because these people do not have a memory of greatness. On the other hand, this second group, the Atlantean group, certainly possessed this memory of greatness and also prove in their daily living now that they have an exceptional skill in a great many forms of arts and crafts. If then we can assume that the Atlantean group may have been the earliest to have left a strongly and clearly marked culture, we may then assume that the Lemurian culture, whatever it was of such an impermanent nature that it did not actually survive. There is the possibility that these people did have a knowledge of monolithic stones and the simple methods of moving them as preserved today in the remnants of Easter Island. Easter Island is regarded as a Lemurian remnant. Actually, however, we have no proof of this. We might just as well assume that these statues were the result of an overlay of Atlantean culture later, because they do show some primitive knowledge of engineering, which up to now we have not been able to associate with Lemuria, but which we know flourished in Atlantis. Now let's think for just a few moments about the idea of the Atlantean mountain in its relationship to group pyramid construction throughout the world. The pyramid, of course, as we know, passes through innumerable variations and refinements. At its beginning, there seems to be the tendency to regard it as a copy of something. There is no doubt that the pyramid builders throughout the world were building from an archetype. Either in their memories or in their records, they were copying something. A pyramid such as that at Cheops does not accumulate, nor does the great pyramid structure which has been recently found in China indicate that these people were merely massing things together. This building program was purposed. And the pyramid, wherever it stands, is a symbol, as it was in Egypt, of the world mountain. And the world mountain almost certainly was symbolic of the first enduring religious structure that man knew, and that was the great university system of Atlantis. Prior to that time, we have no evidence of anything that could have been copied. But this could have been copied. Another point that is interesting is that where these pyramids appear in different parts of the world, their architecture is startlingly similar. There are certain modifications, and with the passing of time, the symbolic pyramid idea began to disappear under elaborate ornamentation, which itself is a sign of decadence. However, the buildings basically are great mathematical solids. They are built approximately in the same theme wherever they are located, and with the exception of local embellishments belonging to later cultures, they are very simple, monumental masses of structure, essentially resembling what we call the Pyramid of Egypt. These pyramids, therefore, seemingly all come from one purpose and design. Now, the idea that we have that the pyramids were the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs is a matter of moot question even now. The Great Pyramid, certainly the oldest, and the archetype for most of the others in Egypt, was most unsuitable to be a royal crypt. It presented serious obstacles for the functional uses we assume inspired it. For example, we can have no understanding as to why ventilating shafts should be provided through 200 feet of masonry to give air circulation to a tomb. It was not done in the case of ordinary tombs. If it had been part of the religion of the Egyptians that their deceased must be given air ventilation, it might be different, but there is no indication that such is the case. Also, if such is the case, why were these air shafts blocked at their inner ends with slabs of stone so that they served no function whatever? Yet these stone slabs are contemporary with the original building. We have no understanding of such procedure. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber is simply not adequate to receive a human body. It is too small for the ceremonial wrappings used in connection with the Egyptian dead. It seems much more like a font than it does like a sarcophagus. Even a comparatively unimportant second or third grade prince would have had a sarcophagus 3 times the size of the one in the Great Pyramid. And yet this was supposedly for the King of Kings, the ruler of them all. Even without additional mummy wrappings or without additional means of the preserving of the body, it would have been difficult to simply get the corpse into the sarcophagus. Something else was evidently intended, and the tomb idea was imposed upon it later. What the building was originally intended for must cause considerable thought, unless we again assume that it was copied from one of the sacred structures of the ancient Atlantean Empire, that it had a meaning deep and mysterious for these people, a meaning which perhaps rooted in their religion, in their spiritual conviction, and was used in connection with the initiatory rites by means of which their knowledge was transmitted. This is quite conceivable also in the fact that there is a well-established report that Plato was initiated in the Great Pyramid. Yet at the time of Plato there was no visible entrance. Therefore, such entrance had to have been through some subterranean connection between the pyramid and other structures. Rumors of such a connection have long endured, but the connection has not yet been clearly identified. But this does not mean that it did not exist. Harmachis, the great Sphinx, is another riddle that goes back to an old way of life. The composite Sphinx monster perhaps is again part of the Atlantean story, having to do with their religious system and rites. Irish people claim that the first teachers of their race came not from the east, from Europe, but from the west, and that ancient robed priests came out of the ocean on the west coast of Ireland, and that these were the ones who instructed them. The Irish have a considerable folklore dealing with Atlantis. There is also a great deal of lore relating to this in the Spanish area and in Portugal. And of course what is left of North Africa bears testimony to the same basic accounts. Thus we have the indication of a stratification of cultures, which becomes a strong defending point in support of our Atlantis hypothesis. We can summarize this hypothesis as we have progressed it this evening then, with certain additional points that we had not previously clarified or brought up. First, that there are evidences of the survival of Atlantean peoples, vestiges of peoples who have for one reason or another remained completely separate, have held on to their traditions, have regarded themselves as dedicated to a sacred destiny, and therefore regarding themselves also with a strange, deep, unchanging pride, a hauteur about themselves, the sense of being a chosen people, a people intended for some strange work of preserving without loss an ancient tradition. This chosen concept certainly moves the Aryas from northern Asia, for the word Aryan means the chosen, or the selected, or the set-apart ones. Similar records occur in China. The Chinese people were the peculiarly selected ones of the Great Father. Their work was predestined for them. They had to carry on a tradition. We can pause again for a moment and say, how old is China? And China is one of the most disappointing countries in the world to approach archaeologically and ethnologically. We assume beyond doubt the vast antiquity of China, but we cannot prove it. We know that China's records are not nearly as adequate as those of Egypt, nor do they go back as far. But behind these records again is a mystery of a China that existed in the Golden Age, a China that was remembered faintly in the stories preserved by Confucius and Mencius, and in the annals of the kings, the Shu King of China, the great historical and political writings. So we come to the Greeks, the Chinese, the Hindus, and now comes something else. Out of all of this comes the story of the Golden Age, the story of the ancient time, which was more splendid than any other time that man has ever known. This Golden Age theory corresponds also with the Golden Age of India. For the Hindus have a belief that in the remote past, long before the coming of the Age of Iron, there was a Golden Age. That this Golden Age failed into an Age of Silver. That this in turn fell into an Age of Bronze. And that finally this gave way to an Age of Iron, or an Age of Death. And these four ages are the four horsemen of the apocalypse who ride forth to the corners of the world. And they are the four yugas of Indian philosophy. These ages all stem from a Golden Age. And this Golden Age is remembered in Africa and remembered by the primitive Plains Indians of our own country, remembered by the Eskimo, remembered by the native of the South Pacific. Everywhere there is a memory of the Golden Age. When it was, no one seems to know. But unlike most natural stories of natural beginnings, the beginning of humanity was radiant. And this comes back to us again in the idea of the fall of man. That man fell from a great and noble destiny to some ignominious and relapsed state. The story of the fall, of the destruction of Lucifer, the blasting out of heaven of his planet, Ragnarok. All of these things seem to tell of rebellion, of an ancient time when there was incredible splendor and then it all vanished away. Or as the Greeks more philosophically arranged it, it declined gradually through the other three ages. This Golden Age has been subject to a great deal of study. Psychologists think perhaps that it is the Golden Age of human childhood. That this Golden Age did not actually refer to a time when man had more, but to a time when man thought less. You see, there are several ways you can be happy in this world. One is to have nothing to worry about, and the other is to have nothing to worry with. Both of these have a tendency to relax us. Psychologically speaking, the normal child who has had a happy childhood produces a series of psychological involvements which later cause it to remember back to the age of innocence, to the Golden Age. The Golden Age of play and no responsibility. The Golden Age of living in a world of fantasy and fairy tale. An age which precedes disillusionment and the sorrows of experience. An age in which there were no fears, but gods in the form of parents take care of everything. Psychologists make a great deal of this particular factor in estimating the character growth of the individual and the possible exaggeration or distortion of this in the creation of the perpetual adolescent. So there's one way of looking at it, that there was this Golden Age of irresponsibility. But as we study this thing, we find that there is a break in the story that doesn't quite fit. The human child coming into this world of wonders is in a golden age of its own irresponsibility, but it is surrounded by a magnificent and involved culture, a culture which may become desperate in the course of living, but with which the child also has immediate contact from the very beginning. This golden age of childhood is not alone in the wilderness. It is at least surrounded by parents that love and understand. And it is difficult to imagine primitive mankind enjoying this sense of security. It is difficult to imagine that there was ever a time when the primitive savage did not have something to worry about. For with this other problem, we find another rudimentary instinct, which we have been unable to trace to its beginning because it goes back further than anything we can know, and that is fear. Primitive man seems to have existed in fear. He was in the presence continually of forces which were menacing to him. He was a kind of neglected waif, an orphan. And it is not quite as easy to understand how this could have caused him to psychologically invent a golden age. It does not seem reasonable that this golden age could exist apart from association with something superior to self, especially when that self is comparatively primitive. It would be conceivable, however, that the concept of a golden age could exist. Was there an archetype for it? If primitive peoples had lived near or upon the outskirts of a great and glorious civilization, which perhaps like a paternal colonizing agent did protect their physical needs, did make it possible for them to pass through a happy childhood, to a degree at least, those particular peoples might have had a golden childhood. Even then, however, there is evidence, as in the case of many children, that this golden childhood is burdened with fears, and that even the best environment cannot prevent the child from ultimately being exposed to that which causes fear. But the whole concept of a golden age does not fit into the theory that man rose from the beast and by the Darwinian concept gradually emerged into humanity through a sort of anthropoid missing link. Something is wrong with the picture. Yet the story of this wonderful place at the beginning of things continues to live, and the peoples claim that there was a time when everything was good, that law and order did prevail, and that as a proof of this, or as part of this, in those days heroic persons, gods, great and wonderful priests, benevolent patriarchs, enlightened elders, grand and noble teachers walked the earth with men, beings who have never been seen again, who finally retired for one reason or another, always promising to return but never coming back. That all this could have belonged to a great civilizing theme that was wiped away and left in its place only a strange void would seem to be a more reasonable answer. The city of the gods vanished. It did not go back up into heaven. Nobody ever said it did. The only ancient legends that we have about this city of the gods, where anything relating to it is mentioned, this is always associated with two things, or one of them. First of all, that these peoples, living in this peace and glory and happiness, disobeyed. And through this disobedience they forfeited their share in this golden city and were sent out of the garden like Adam and Eve, cast out into a wilderness, and were forced to clothe themselves with the skins of animals, and that the angels were placed at the gates of Eden with a flaming sword to prevent these sinners from ever getting back in again. That they, from this paradisical world, they were forced out into a world of suffering and pain and death. That is one version of the story. Where the fall version, or the descent of man, or the loss of the divine prerogatives is not present, then we have the simple account that at an ancient time this world of the gods was destroyed, that it vanished, that it wasn't there anymore. And nearly always this vanishing is attended by combustion and destruction, as in the twilight of the Nordic gods. Either the gods failed and died, or man failed and lost the right to share in the glory of the gods. In any event, man lost his golden age. He was cast out into responsibility. He had to grow up in a strange wilderness. Now, this golden age was not merely an age of peace and comfort, according to the Greek concept at least. It was an age of achievements. It was an age of great and beautiful cities, of wonderful towns and palaces and monuments, of universities and schools, of hospitals, and of social orders that were so wonderful that they dwelt together in peace and amity, and there was no dishonesty and no stealing, no crime, no sin and no death. And all these things were part of this golden age. So that this was a rich golden age, according to the old legends. But when it finally fell, man came instead into an age of gold, which was not the same thing, and from that time on his troubles commenced. So we have two stories now. One of a people who disobeyed and who fell, and the other of a people innocent, who did nothing particularly themselves that anyone can be aware of, but whose wonderful protecting world was taken away from them. They were not marked as sinners. In the sagas, the Nordic sagas, the Elder and Young Edda, humanity didn't do anything particularly wrong. It got into some trouble largely due to the machineries of the gods themselves. But this whole great tragedy of the Nordic myth is not the result of man's wickedness, but the result of the curse of the Nibelungen, the curse of primordial passions and prides played out by the gods upon the broad plains of Asgard. Now, is it quite conceivable that we have here in mythology also the two parts that are necessary for a story, that these two stories do not conflict with each other, but represent the Atlantean deluge as it was applicable to two groups. First, the Atlanteans themselves, and second, to the primitive peoples around them who had come under their influence. That the Atlanteans themselves might well feel that, having declared war, as proven by their final attack upon the Athenians, and Plato's record that they had disobeyed the gods who had warned them many times, and had finally brought this disaster upon themselves, we can say that the story of a fall, of a disobedience, of a transgression against the great edicts of Poseidon, this could well have been the story of the driving of these people out of their paradisical world, and the placing of cherubs with flaming swords to protect the entrance. Perhaps this entrance again has something to do with the Pillars of Hercules as the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. On the other hand, those people who lived only in the shadow of this splendor, who only knew that in the midst of the world there rose this wonderful city, those who were then the primitive people, might well have gained certain important help from the colonizing and merchandising of the Atlantean mercantile, and of the contacts with missionaries or teachers or priests or travelers from this great empire. When this empire went down, these other people were not being punished for a crime. They lost their friend. They lost their teacher. They lost their guide. They lost something which perhaps in their ignorance they had abjectly worshipped because it was so much greater than their own achievement. These lesser peoples lost the directive power which might have more early brought them to a civilized state. They were blessed in that they did not share in the delinquencies which are traditionally said to have destroyed Atlantis. But for them, a golden age vanished. A wonderful divine world sank forever under the sea. The gods they had known never returned. And the great empire of gods, ruled over by Atlas, carrying the earth upon his shoulders, this was gone. And this that had once been a comparatively simple historical circumstance, in the course of thousands of years of tradition, without adequate written records, with the gradual dramatizing and the failing memory of the aged, from generation to generation, left only a dream behind. A dream, however, which still has the essential picture, the story of a great and noble race of gods, of heroes, of those who came before men, as we know men, and who vanished away either for their sins or for some unspecified reason. Thus the Golden Age gives us another clue to our Atlantic story. It also gives us a certain psychological clue. Let us assume for a moment that the Atlantic story is in a way the story of humanity. That in this story we have the descent of certain primitive knowledge in man himself. I think it is interesting to go back to some legends. There are some legends in Tibet which have a bearing on this. In Tibet there was a very wonderful and very great mystical teacher, Milarepa. His hymns and poems and songs are highly revered in this great northern land. Milarepa, however, was born with strange gifts, strange powers. As a small child, he suddenly discovered that within his consciousness there was the ability to affect almost anything he came in contact with. He was a born miracle worker. But as a small child, he didn't know what to do about it. And because he was a small child, and because he was subject to all the natural instincts of children, he began to use this power wrongly. When people heard him, he murmured some strange words that he came to understand in his heart, and these people fell dead. He was able to destroy them with a glance. He was able to curse their crops. He was able to cause their cattle to be barren. And in the old legends about this young man, he really had quite an eventful career, the early part of which was spent mostly in avenging himself upon those he disliked. He found that it was quite simple and easy to use the God powers which he possessed and about which he had no moral understanding. He used them badly, and as a result of that brought in the Indian legends heavy karma upon his own nature, which later had to be tamed. But growing older, he began to be more responsible, and having passed out of the foolishness and selfishness of childhood, he associated himself with learned teachers and good monks and abbots, and in time grew to renounce the world and to dedicate his entire life only to the works of good, thus to pay the debts of his earlier misdeeds and also to become the servant and saint that he was later to become. And this formula in substance is behind many saints of Western lands, for many saints were reformed sinners. Now, applied to our Atlantis problem, we seem to see another peculiarity of human nature. Primitive man certainly possessed a psychic contact with life which we no longer possess. As primitive man, he may have developed his knowledge of this to a prodigious degree and built a civilization strong and tall with pride, the pride of his ability to control nature. And out of his arrogance and selfishness, he set the factors in motion which ultimately undid his own empire, destroyed it, by his selfishness and by the misuse of power. Having thus lost, in some mysterious way, the right to use this power, the very processes which he had set in motion set up their own karma, and this karma blocked these faculties in him so that he no longer had them. In this very moment by itself, a world of inner mysteries, a world of light and color, the worlds of the invisible planes described in Eastern philosophy, man's mysterious contact with the causal universe by means of the mysterious third eye of the Dharma. This would have been blocked out, and he would have seen another world of the gods gradually vanish before him, because he had broken faith with the principles and powers by which he had the right to know this world. So Plato could well have drawn upon this concept also, and this could have its part in the story of the Golden Age. But the Golden Age could also have been one in which man, conscious both on the material level and on the internal, intuitive, apperceptive level, could therefore have built a strange world for himself here, based upon his insight into a spiritual world with which he still had contact. He could have lived in two worlds and fashioned a most glamorous shadow here of the world that he knew there. He could have created, therefore, in his primitive knowledge or his primitive insight, intuitively, instinctively, a great world that was not the product of his own reason, but was the product of the fact that he still possessed the internal contacts with the causal universe around him. Then, as he gradually developed his own intellect, as he gradually strengthened his mind and his resources, and became more and more objectively polarized, the Indian legends tell us that this third eye retired into the brain and ceased to be active. And by degrees, this mysterious world of the gods faded out, and he was left entirely to his own resources. He then had left to him and to the memory of those who came after him only the shadows he had fashioned. The substance was gone. He had forms that were no longer understandable. He had lost the ability to continue to copy living forces. So he built at one time, long ago, something he could never build again. He built it, and gradually, in the course of time, it fell into ruin because his own faculties no longer supported it. And thus your golden age and your ancient worlds and all these things can be part of one tremendous cosmic drama, each a recapitulation or symbolic projection of the other. To go back a moment to Frobenius and his African pattern of things, we have therefore here two levels, a series of levels in fact. We have the possibility that these haughty Africans of Ife have this strange subconscious story, perhaps a story that is more vital to them than it is to us because they are still nearer to the primitive than we are, and may have apperceptive powers that we do not know. Primitive people believe they visit the celestial worlds in sleep, and from these celestial worlds bring back strange and wonderful accounts. They visit the temples and palaces of their gods in dreams and in visions, indicating that they believe that there is a mysterious world beyond our vision, but not distant in place, and that this world vanished from our consciousness because of our own departure from the primitive ways of natural life. And also in more recent times because by degrees we have lost all interest in it and have substituted for the old patterns the gradual development of a material civilization or culture of our own. Frobenius seems to feel that the African peoples form a strong proving link to the various Atlantic hypotheses, and that by studying in those areas we would come directly into not only the legends but the ancient rituals and the ceremonies and the mystical rites which may once have belonged to Atlantis, may have caused its rise or may have brought its fall, but that this entire ancient world is supported upon a strange, shadowy framework of magic, and that it is the divine magic which the gods gave and which the Atlanteans perverted that is supposed to have caused their fall. So that in these areas we get a further development of these stories. And the Africans themselves do believe, many of them, that they came from this glorious world of long ago. And if we are to search for it anywhere in the material sphere, it would seem to tie in to the broad concept of the Atlantic continent. And now we are 1 minute over time, so we're going to have to stop.